throughout 2020, myself and Petah Marian tag teamed on co-hosting the WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast. But as we announced the 10 trends for 2021, Petah and I thought we'd come together to talk through the highlights. So Petah, the first one on this list is kind of a quirky one, digisexuality. Was I surprised to see this in the list? Maybe not. 2020 was a very strange year. So weird that it felt like it was 2 years. Do you think that's the real reason that this has snuck onto our list for the coming 12 months?
Well, actually, this is something we've been talking about for quite some time. We first started writing about this in early 2019. Cassandra Napoli on the Insight team, she wrote the first report on this, and then I did something else on the changing face of intimacy. So we've been writing about this for some time already. But the reason why it probably has a little bit more resonance right now is obviously everything that's happened through the pandemic, that sort of fear of intimacy, fear of coming together, fear of physical touch, fear of all the messy things that happen when you're emotionally entangled with another person, which has really kind of accelerated this trend that we picked up, which was really it was really an emerging trend in 2019 when we started talking about it, and it's kind of accelerated a little bit through this period now. And what it really looks like when we were talking about it in 2019 was this idea of people identifying as being digisexuals and using items or technologies such as VR, AI, and robotics to create those moments of physical contact and intimacy that you might normally get from another human being. But I think what we're seeing change now is what digisexuality means to more mainstream consumers. And that's really kind of taking the forms of things that aren't necessarily technological. Well, it is technological, but not as self-identificationary. That's not necessarily a word, but you know what I mean. In terms of, people using things like oral pornography, apps like Dipsy, which are becoming sort of a little bit more mainstream, particularly for women. Also that sex toys really sold out during the first pandemic. What we were seeing is this huge demand for them in the first wave of lockdowns that we were experiencing March. And then also the rise of certain influencers that are really starting to create that boyfriend experience without necessarily having any of the real emotional entanglement of being in a real relationship.
Okay, you've got to tell me more. What does boyfriend experience mean, but without the emotional entanglement of a real relationship?
Well, so one of the things I've come across on TikTok is this guy called The Real Rahul Rai, and he has 2.3 million TikTok followers. And he has started selling these things called boyfriend audios. It's part of his boyfriend kit. And in the kit, you get like a cushion with his face on it that you can cuddle up to. But you also get these things called boyfriend audios, which are audio tracks that make it a snap to take me to the entertainment experience on the go, he says, which is basically he gives you like these kind of audio files that you can listen to as you're going to bed, when you wake up and you need that boost in the morning. It's just creating that kind of like emotional cheerleader that people need and maybe aren't necessarily getting at the moment.
Do you think there's sort of something, I was going to say tragic isn't the right word, something kind of sad about this, that after a year, and let's face it, it's still going on with people not being able to interact with people in person, do you see this as a long-term shift which is going to create kind of emotional disattachment, with other humans? Or do you think this is just a new way to connect that we have grown more used to and therefore actually could enhance real life relationships?
I think it varies really on the person and the age and the person's circumstances. I mean, I think for people that have been living alone through this pandemic period, it has been really difficult. And I think there is a lot of fear and a lot of concern around sort of moving back into that physical real life dating sort of situation even now. And so that might mean that fear will continue. But maybe it's just a stopgap for people as they're sort of starting to pursue new relationships. I mean, what I would hope that we would come out of the pandemic with is an increased desire for connection with each other, because we have been so separated, and we have seen a lot of behaviours that really kind of point to that sort of situation if we think about the rise in sort of community focuses and things like that. So it's really, I think it's just going to be another tool in the emotional resilience toolkit that we might need moving forward.
So the second trend we've got on the list also follows the digital theme here, and that's genuine influencers, which I'm fascinated by. And I think it's a good advancement in this area. Influencers have had a fairly bad rap, and they definitely had to change strategies almost more than anyone else during the pandemic. That idea of, bragging about things you've got just left a really bad taste in everyone's mouth when the world was going through such horrific times and recessionary headlines and things like that. But what our Insight team are predicting is these genuine influencers, so people who have something really important to say, are going to become part of global organizations' strategy, not just their marketing strategy, but a real way of getting the correct news across. And I was fascinated by this stat: 61%, I think, of under 35s. And this was just in the UK, we're using social media as a news source this year. Now, obviously, that's not great news for big media organisations, but it does show how actually many generations are getting their information. How I guess, what advice would you be giving businesses at the moment in terms of using this? And is this a new career we should all be thinking about?
Well, I mean, it's really multifaceted, because I think that, obviously we've got the paid influencers that are really moving into this sort of genuine influencers narrative. But then there's also peer influencers as well that are sort of starting to emerge, which the UN has just announced a new initiative to combat misinformation. And that's really about sort of sharing information and helping people share that information with their direct communities. But I think for businesses moving forward, how they tap into this is really around truth and honesty and clarity, which are all things that we've been talking about for quite some time. And it's really that sort of narrative around education. And again, that's also something that the marketing team on Insight have been writing so much about in recent years. And it's just really about continuing that sort of thing of truth, honesty, clarity. But I think what's really interesting here, and where there might have been a little bit of backlash, is that some of these influencers are getting paid by governments to share this information, which has sort of rubbed people a little bit the wrong way in some sectors, particularly as we're going through this incredibly difficult time. And they kind of felt that these influencers should be doing this sort of work for free.
Yeah, I think that's a debate that could be had back and forth. I think if it is your job, and let's face it, there is a sizable community now for whom, social media is their full-time career. They've been looking for different ways to bring money in, and the same as, people in, let's say, more traditional jobs. And if you need to get important information across to a wide group of the population, and they are not looking at news headlines, they're not watching the news, they're not consuming even news via websites, this is one way of doing it. I'm really interested, something as prestigious as the World Health Organization has tapped into this, less as a trend, but more as a strategy for them to ensure that millions of people get the information which they're concerned otherwise doesn't get out there. I think it's fascinating. I think the next step then is, what does this mean to more typical brands who have done very well, some of them exceptionally well, by using the kind of the influences of 3-4 years ago, which is, paying them to write about a product and to feature it in their home or, on their bookcase or on their bathroom shelfie. And that, I think, that seems, I was going to say old-fashioned. In a fast-moving world, that does seem quite old-fashioned now. So how do you use them? And I think maybe it's that peer-to-peer point that you made just then, which is, we're not going to be looking to the ones with the millions and millions of followers who are posting something commercial every day. It is coming to the, people like us, and what are they using? And I think to the kind of people I follow, and as someone who was a journalist in a previous career, I tend to follow journalists, and those are the ones that I trust, rather than people who are just posting nice pictures, which I know they've been sponsored to do so.
Well, I mean, I think that comes back to the real heart of the whole influencer conversation and debate, right? When the sort of influencer shift sort of started to take place, it was really that shift of, how do I find someone that's like me that's talking about stuff? And then it used to be, when we start talking about the first wave of influencers, when we talk about blogging and things like that, before it was, corrupted by money, which is obviously not necessarily corrupt at all, but, that's sort of the way that it's sort of sometimes perceived, is that they were doing it for the love of it, and they were doing it because they wanted to share their ideas. And but to go back to what you were saying just a second ago about journalists, I think one of the things that we have seen through this pandemic period is actually the return of trust in journalists, in experts, in scientists, and all of those sorts of people that perhaps consumers were shifting their attention away from. And I think, one of those things that I find kind of heartening through this period is really that focus back on those people that do have a really expert point of view, because, we have had this infodemic. We are facing these waves and waves and waves of misinformation and disinformation out in the marketplace, and people don't really know what to believe. So we do need to be using every single tool in our arsenal to make sure that truth and honest and helpful information is getting to consumers, be that via governments, be that via companies, be that via any kind of organization that serves people in the world.
Now, if we look back over far longer than the last 12 months in the pandemic, retail is the sector which has probably been hit hardest by our changing world. And then with 2020 and the pandemic, they were, it kind of felt like the final nail in the coffin. But what we have seen is, innovative brands come out fighting in a world where people couldn't go in store in the same way that they could. And the trend that we've highlighted as one that we think will continue to grow is this idea of gamified retail. Is this just for millennials, Gen Zers who are used to that kind of gaming in those third world spaces? Or do you think this is something which is actually going to hit every generation? And could this be the saviour of the retail economy?
I mean, I don't necessarily think it's going to be the savior of the retail economy, because I think the structural issues in the retail economy are so large and broad that it's going to require an incredibly multifaceted response. But that said, gamified retail, I think, is a really important and really interesting one. I don't necessarily think it's just for Gen Z and millennials. If you think about the people that are spending time on Facebook games, they're people like my mom, who is a boomer, and and they're people that they are spending loads of time on those games. And where we've really seen this sort of take root is really in China, but it's really an extension of like some of the trends. Again, it's the shift to online that we've seen, which has happened so rapidly. I mean, it's been happening for a really long time, obviously, but it's accelerated so much this year. It's something like 30% of retail transactions will take place this year online. So it's really about sort of starting to put into place some of those entertainment elements that we were really looking at in retail for many years when we were talking, I'm sure that you've spoken about it at conferences as well, that idea of experiential retail. We're really starting to think about, well, what does experiential e-commerce look like? And that's really around gamification and things like that, because it's really about finding that kind of happy balance between some of the trends that we've been talking about for some time around things like clean commerce, smoothing the path to transaction and making that really easy for the client, whilst also kind of creating those moments of joy and entertainment and fun in there as well. And that's really where that gamification trend is coming from. But, there's loads of really, really good examples of this coming out of China.
I think it's a really good point. I've talked a lot about creating moments of joy this year in a world that can sometimes seem very dark and gloomy. How do we get those moments of escapism, especially the large swathes of the population who have moved to a working from home environment, which has its upsides, but there can be that, merge between work and play or a lack of delineation, full stop. I'm sitting here recording this in my office, which is the corner of my bedroom. How you create a switching off is very difficult. And I think moments of joy, moments of fun, little highlights in your day which make you stop thinking about work, make you stop thinking about the terrible headlines you're reading, is so important. And making shopping enjoyable again when you're no longer doing it with your friends and stopping for a smoothie or coffee halfway round is really important. I'm fascinated to see how this particular trend evolves in the coming years. And to your point, one which is really coming out of China, but how other countries adopt it and utilise it in ways that work for, the consumers in their area of the world, I think will be really interesting.
And I think it's really important that when we talk about gamified retail, we talk about it in the sense of games rather than gamifying purchase behaviours. So something like, I've seen some retailers doing things like where if you buy, X amount of money, you get a reward, and that kind of creates a gamification mechanism in the sort of risk and reward kind of perspective. We're not talking about that here. It's really about fun games with characters and pleasure and toys and rewards as well, that do mean to lead to discounts or free items with purchase and things like that. But it's really about this idea of fun rather than sort of gambling.
So one of the populations, a very large population that was really badly hit during the pandemic were women. And millions and millions of high-achieving women who were effectively driven back into the home as children were, kept out of schools and nurseries and things like that. It's been exceptionally difficult, I think, for everyone. There's very few people who have been sheltered from the impact of COVID-19, but women in particular have really had a hard time. Now, one of the trends that we are predicting are she-covery strategies. Talk to me a little bit about this, because I think this is something that we don't think is contentious, but perhaps is something that's going to require a lot of hard work and from, all levels of society, all individuals, if we're going to get women back onto a level playing field with their male counterparts.
I think this one for me, when we were discussing this episode, was the most create tomorrow one in terms of the list, in terms of the things that would require work for companies to achieve, and that's really necessary for them to do so, especially for people in our kind of client sector, because if we start to think about, obviously, the terrible time that retailers are having on a macro basis, and many of those are obviously our clients, but also on a micro basis as, retailers start to look at right-sizing retail estates and closing stores and things like that. A lot of, most of the people that work in physical retail stores are women. And obviously, as you close those stores, the people that are being impacted are women. And that's all really around sort of things like flexible work. And as people are shifting to e-commerce, largely the people that are being hired are men because of those e-commerce distribution roles, delivery drivers. I hate to play into sexual stereotypes and gender role stereotypes, but they do tend to be skew more male. And so what we really need to be starting to do is to really start to think about not only how do we get like the broad swaths of women back into working and into offices, but also how do we help those women that have been negatively impacted by these large scale shifts that are happening as well, because we start to think about what the broader impact of those things are. And women do tend to control most of the household spending, and they do make a lot of the decisions. And the broader impact of closing retail stores has on communities and things like that. And so we really need to start thinking about ways of getting women back into work and making sure that they are not negatively impacted by what's been happening over the past year.
I think my real hope with all of this is that, this is a kind of another light under the fire of the entrepreneur age. And I was listening to a retail expert on the radio the other morning who had a very optimistic take on the big brands failing on the high street, which was, you have these big spaces that can now be passed over to pop-ups, to small brands who want to have a go. Now, obviously, that requires landlords to take hits on rents. It requires a radical rethink of what the high street, high streets all over the world look like. But women have shown themselves to be amazing entrepreneurs and have latched onto that as career choices because it means that they can control their time better. They can make the choices about how they balance home and work. I guess I have cause to be optimistic, but I think it's going to require, as I said before, huge amounts of effort on every level of society, and governments are going to have to play their part. Big businesses are going to have to play their part as well. And it is going to require women themselves to take the first step and to demand that the other people in their life, male and female, also do the heavy lifting too.
Yeah, the other part of that is that we have seen, particularly with families. Obviously, I think when we talk about this trend in particular, I think it's really about mothers with the young children that have been the most affected by this. And if we think about family, housework and things like that, men have stepped up a little bit, quite a bit actually, to sort of start to create more of a level playing field around household work and things like that. But there is still a lot of work to be done. And I think as we start to think about all of this sort of stuff, it's not just, if we think about the companies and the countries that have performed well through the pandemic, they have all been led by women. So, it really is a case of hiring, celebrating, promoting, championing women across the businesses, but also creating those spaces for female entrepreneurs as well. And also men just stepping up and being great husbands, fathers, dads, and making sure that they're doing their part as well.
So coming to our last trend that we're going to talk about today, At the beginning of the pandemic, I definitely wasn't a cliche. So while everyone was making sourdough and doing all these other things, I couldn't understand how anyone had time to do that. I was just barely holding it together.
I was a massive sourdough freak. I was a total cliche. I was the opposite of you.
But I've caught up rapidly, which means by the time the second lockdown came around in the UK, I bought myself a kitten. And the one thing I've been doing lots more of is running. Now, I've always been a runner. I've always done lots of exercise. But with gyms closed, the classes that I used to do no longer open for visits, I have been running an awful lot. So our final trend, which is the circular runner, is one that I think is just phenomenal, because I bought a new pair of trainers right at the beginning, special running ones. And, now I'm like, well, I've definitely done the mileage of them. Is it time to kick them off and buy a new pair, which just doesn't seem environmentally friendly? It doesn't seem sustainable, when actually every other aspect of my life this year has been much more sustainable. So the circular runner one for me, again, very optimistic. Tell me a little bit, are there some great examples of this we could talk about?
I mean, this is one I'm also very excited about too, for different reasons. Because, I have been running a little bit as well, but I got trail running shoes because I've been running along a muddy sort of pathway behind my flat. But the reason I'm so excited about this is it's something that we've been writing about for a really long time, and it's something that I've been really excited about and really invested in for a very long time, because it is something that we've been really optimistic about. And the one, I guess, there are a few that are sort of set to come out next year. We've got the Adidas Ultra Boost DNA Loop. We've got Salomon is launching the Index One, and then On Running is launching a subscription-based shoe where you can own your shoes by subscription. So you pay a monthly fee and then you rotate them in and out. Because one of the things when we've been doing our research on this is that brands have a really hard time getting the shoes back. People don't necessarily want to give them back on the timelines that they want to get them back on. But the other reason why I'm really, really excited about this trend is that it really reflects the convergence of so many different ideas and so many different trends over the course of a really long time. If you think about things like Adidas and Nike launching the Prime Knit and the Fly Knit, that happened in 2012. And that's kind of one of the things that have paved the way for trainers that have fewer materials in them, because one of the things that has stopped recycling of trainers and running shoes is that there's 12 to 15 different materials and processes and glues and things, and it's just not really feasible for that to happen. So if you start to think about a single material upper that can then be either pulled apart from the sole, or if you have a full monomaterial trainer, then that's something that can be really recycled. So there's so many different things. If you think about 3D printing and different manufacturing processes, it's just for a massive nerd like me, I'm just super, super excited about the fact that this is actually finally coming to life, and in a product that is designed to be destroyed. When you wear a running shoe, you are pounding the pavement, you are really damaging them. And so, for that to be the reality for that sort of a product, I think it's very, very exciting.
I also think it's, this is leading the field. And I think what we will see, or what I hope we will see, is other manufacturers in a similar space, but maybe not necessarily sportswear, who are going to follow this lead as well. It's like the winter boots. Every year, everyone wants a new pair of winter boots. Although I will say this will be one of the few years when I don't buy a new pair, because I've basically lived in slippers for the last 8 months.
Me and my Birkenstocks living together.
But why wouldn't you do something like that as well? Take that, that leather shoe back and reimagine it for a new season. So I think this is definitely one to watch, and one that, whatever area of the fashion world you work in, or in fact any consumer goods, is there something you can learn from this? Now, we're running out of time. We've just had time to talk about 5 of the trends that are going to be available to all WGSN subscribers this month. But there are plenty of others. Have you got any other favourites in there that kind of stand out?
One of the ones I'm really excited about is the evolution of CBD to CDN, and that's really about this idea that CBD, so the cannabinoid, is evolving, and it really has stronger sedative qualities, which is something that I'm really in need of at the moment. Obviously, pandemic-related stress is always keeping me awake at night, so it's something that I'll be very keen on learning more about come 2021. And what about for you?
So my favourite in there is the chickenless eggs. So as a segan, i.e. someone who's vegan but eats fish, I have no dairy in my life. I'm not much of a baker, but sometimes, you see a great recipe and you want to bind it together. And I have already bought into this. So I picked up some Oggs Aquafaba, little packets of them, in my local supermarket. And they've been sitting in my fridge now for a month, but they last, which is great. So I will report back in a future podcast about how my baking experiments go with chickenless eggs.
Can't wait to hear more about it.
Awesome. It was great chatting today, Peter. Thank you so much.
And with you, it was so nice to be together.
We'll make it a date this time next January, and we can start talking about the 10 trends for 2022, which is just a scary idea that's only 12 months away now.
I'm putting it in my calendar now. I can't wait.